Hunter Eisenhower, the man. This is one we've been waiting for, and everyone's been asking for, and it's something that we were talking about literally like 3 days ago. We were like, let's just hop on a podcast and talk through all of our questions and issues together. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate you coming on, and Danny and I have been literally just trying to dive into your force system for the past couple of weeks, and it's been incredible. Um, maybe we could just start with like a quick like, what are you currently working on, and what's your role for people that haven't been introduced to you yet?
Yeah, so my 9 to 5 day job is at Arizona State with men's basketball, and that keeps me fairly busy, obviously. And then the side projects, kind of like the passion projects that have started, and they've been going for a while now. Back to when I worked for the Kings, were just like the creation of the force system. And to be honest with you, when it first became an idea in my mind, it wasn't. It did. I had no plan of it becoming like a system as it is now, and how I think about programming and doing everything. Um, but it's kind of just ballooned to that as I've like added layers to it. So it started with this notion of like, why are we so obsessed with concentric outputs and strength? And starting to mess around with force plates and look at ground reaction forces of different movements. And I won't go through this whole thing step by step. I'll make it quick, but um, I just began to ask myself, like, we talk about strength being one rep maxes traditionally. And it's like, is that the end all be all? And then I started messing around with force plate, looking at ground reaction forces of different things like drop catches and depth drops, and kind of like redefine what strength meant to me. And that just became like one of the pillars, high force. And now there's a deceleration aspect to it. Linear speed is obviously something that's extremely important, as you guys know and you guys deal with a ton. And then this idea of elasticity, which is kind of obscure and hard to define, but it was something that I think is important. And if you look at some of the best athletes in the world, they rely on connective tissue for movement primarily, um, and it's what makes them elite. And I was thinking, like, what if we could feed every athlete a little bit of this? So linear speed, elasticity became fast force, and then I was thinking, man, like, athletes get beat up and tendons take a beating, and musculature needs some sort of health promotion aspect to it, and that really like tissue focus training with slow force and all the other things that I was missing. I'm getting an echo. You
Yeah,
guys hear me?
Danny, meet yours.
And then like the other aspects of training that I think are important, the crawling, the crouching, some of the human stuff that I think is missing in a lot of programs from a general perspective became human force. So it was four pillars, they all fit together, and that's how I think about programming. Now recently I've been trying to, because the way I think about programming, a lot of the year is on this kind of like superpower spectrum of muscular movers to elastic movers, um, and trying to quantify that. And typically, when I thought about training, it was kind of just a subjective approach to what I felt. And now I'm working on a project with the what I call the Archetype Quadrants, where
Mm-hmm.
it's a pretty simple way to quantify the spectrum, look at the effectiveness of the spectrum, and there's four quadrants, obviously, that I've named, and putting together a little project about, hey, this is where your athletes sit within the quadrants. These are the steps you take within a force system perspective to move them around the quadrants where you think they should move. Because I know we'll talk about like James Wild stuff, and his quadrants are strategy based. So it's not necessarily to say that a bounder is better than a driver or a driver is better than a bouncer, but my quadrants, there is an effectiveness component because we're looking at jump height on the y-axis. So it's not just strategy based, and we
Mm.
ideally want to move athletes left or right depending on their structure, their makeup, and then we do want to move them vertical because the goal would be to put them in one of the top two quadrants, either a whip or a cannon,
Mm.
which is what I've coined them. So that's been my latest thing because I think it really ties the force system together. It's not just like a, hey, these are some training things, throw them on your athletes and see what sticks. It's like, no, this is like how you evaluate your athletes. This is how you profile your athletes. And then these are strategic ways to move them within the quadrants where you want them to go with the force system.
No, I love it. And there's a lot of follow up there.
Yeah.
I think first question for me is going back into the force system and just those four quadrants, and just generally overlay like what it is. Like we understand high force and fast force and slow force and human force. So maybe like some exercise examples and kind of how you came up with those, just for people who have never heard of it before, and then we could dive into specifics on what those things are.
Yeah. So I'll start with high. So high force, if you were to break it down from like a principle perspective, it's deceleration and high ground reaction forces. So if you're out on the field or a court, I follow a similar model to the breaking performance framework that Damon Harper and those guys came out with from a research perspective, and they talk about breaking elementary exercise, breaking
Yeah, for sure.
developmental exercises, and that's a pretty clean way for me to kind of consolidate things. Unfortunately, I don't have a 1080 or some type of motorized resistance, so a lot of like the overspeed decels are happening with bands, and just got some PJF
Yeah,
bands which are dope.
yeah.
And
Shout
then
out PJ.
yeah, for sure. So we'll be on the court from an evaluation standpoint. We're looking at like a lateral 505, horizontal 1005. And then once we get to the weight room, there's a progression through high force. So I think a lot of the potential naysayers of the force system are like, well, it's still important to like lift heavy, and there's still qualities you can get from heavy trap bar deadlift. And yeah, there is. Like, I'm not saying you just throw that out. So the first portion of high force training is traditional high intensity loading. I just get away from it and progress from it like a lot faster than I think most people do. So we'll
Mm,
hit traditional high intensity loading, whatever exercise you want to fill it, like trap bar deadlift, rear foot elevated, split squat, whatever. And we'll do it for a while. But once guys get to the point where it's like, I have a basketball player who's 190 pounds and he puts 105 pounds in each hands and hits 3 reps on rear foot elevated split squat, it's like, okay, am I going to continue to give him the 110s, the 115s? No, I'm not. So the next layer to that is moving to super maximal eccentric loading, which is new. Typically, it was straight to um, drop catches, but I messed around with some super maximal eccentric loading this off season, and I think it's really potent. So we go super maximal eccentric loading, and I do that some different ways with trap bars, with pit sharks. Then we transition to drop catches. This is where we get.
how you doing with trap bars?
So I didn't know how I felt about this, but I was like, you know what, we're gonna try it with a couple guys and see how it works. And me and my GA and a couple interns, they'd pick up when we first tried it. It wasn't very heavy, so it wasn't truly super maximal. We got to that like a few weeks later, but it would be pick up. We'd be standing with plates on either side, and we just
Mm,
created this system of like words we said to initiate the slide, words we said once the slide was good, and then the athlete started lower. So in all, they had
mm,
to stand with the top at the top of the trap bar for probably 2 seconds longer than they would if we weren't putting plates on. But it was
right, right.
smooth. And at first I was like, well, what if we like hit the trap bar, it starts to sway, whatever. But it was smooth every time we did it, so it was cool.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
the pitch shark actually is like my favorite way to do it because obviously that's not going to move, and you can put like
yeah,
100 pound plate on each side and get like truly super maximal, and then you just pull it off at the bottom.
yeah. Put off. I love that.
And then you go drop catches, which I'll just transition whatever exercise we're doing from a traditional loading perspective, whether it's rear foot elevated split squat or trap bar or pitch shark, which I use a lot, and we just transition to drop catches. So
Mm.
typically that's like 60% of whatever you project their maximal strength level to be. And now
And
it's
this is
standing.
still in high force.
This is still all on high force. This is just a
Yeah,
progression through high force.
I think a cool thing that I started, like, I know you said this, but I didn't realize it at first. But you produce such high forces in rear foot elevated split squat, drop catches, and maybe explain just why and how you came to that.
Well, I mean, if you think about force, it's just mass times acceleration. And I think that like people say a heavy, whatever, back squat produces a lot of force, but does it really? Because the mass side of that equation is extremely high. The acceleration portion of that equation is extremely low.
Mm-hmm.
So a way to manipulate that is just like take some from mass, add some to acceleration, because if mass is so high, you're not going to be able to accelerate unless you're doing a drop catch. And manipulate that equation so both sides of that are optimal, and then force does go up. So yeah, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
If you do a rear foot elevated split squat on plate, it's super heavy, and then you hold 60% of that, stand at the top and drop as fast as you can and slam on the brakes, the peak
Yep.
force is going to be drastically different.
Yeah.
So we'll do drop catches and then we'll transition. Last piece is just transitioning to depth drops, and doing depth drops.
Love
Anyways,
it.
Danny, do you have a question?
Hearing you describe all of that, like, kind of takes me back to when we first got introduced, and when we first kind of started talking, whatever that was, 2.5 years ago. And like, certainly in no way am I taking credit for any of this. What you have done has been like taking that initial idea and conversation that I remember us talking about, and you just really put a lot of objectivity to it and have done a really, really great job with this. But this is kind of the pedestal that I've been beating the drum from for a long time now, is like, we have misrepresented what the effect of strength training is as it relates to sport. And because we have been so myopic to the measurable component of strength, we have been just glued to outcomes. And it kind of gives us this blind eye to all of these different types of contractions and these different expressions of force, where the measurability of strength, in my mind, is some combination of what you can express and then also what you can endure. And this is, again, like a selfish little bias plug here, but the endurance part, or the ability to endure, withstand forces, to me speaks more to the health side. It's great if you're really robust and you can produce a lot of force, but if you can't do that over a continued period of time, well, then what's it for? And so when I hear you describe your force system, the main thing that sticks out to me, aside from being a brilliant organization, is that we are doing a better job accounting for the distribution of forces rather than just stacking on those outputs. And I think that's a really critical thing.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And when I think about the four pillars, when I think about like health, I think about slow force. But whenever I think about the rest of it, high force really is like a protective pillar for the force system, because I expose my guys to more high forces, more eccentric loading at different speeds than I've ever exposed any athlete to over the course of any time period. And
Mm.
now with those guys, when I'm watching them like play, I'm like supremely confident that they're going to be fine. Now, knock on wood, like stuff happens, but I'm like supremely confident that with the exposures I gave them and continue to dose throughout this preseason in season period, like I don't want to like it bulletproof and all this shit gets thrown around so much, but like I'm just supremely confident when I'm watching them play that like I know that the forces they experience and the amount of decels and eccentric contractions that they experience in their sport, I'm like they've been exposed to a lot more, and then
Yeah.
the last piece is you begin to layer in some of the 10 by 10 stuff with Derek Hansen stuff, and I manipulate a little bit at the end of the off season, right before the preseason, where we're like shortening the deceleration portion, so it's still a 10-yard excel into like a 6-yard decel, and we're hitting 30 to 40 of those, and it's like I feel confident with the exposures we gave them, just from a high force perspective, that they're going to be robust, and um, it's so far so good.
What's the first year that you did this? Like, when did you start the force system
So
with
the
with
fourth,
Arizona State?
well, I started when I got here. It's just improved and been improved and refined the whole time. But my first year of like, at this point, looking back, a very bastardized version of it was with the Kings when I was there, and that was like full time with the G League, and then I had two NBA guys that I was working with. And looking back, like it was horrible, and it's nothing like it is now. But that would be so. This is my fourth year using it on athletes.
Love it. What how did the sport coaches buy into it? Like, how's your head coach feel about it?
I would say that like I've been very blessed because you hear like horror stories of coaches, sport coaches being like
Hmm.
very hands on, too much so, and trying to dictate a ton. And I've just like I guess gotten very lucky throughout my career that I haven't dealt with coaches that dictate things. And I've never worked for a coach that's like, I need to see their 1 rep maxes at the end of the summer go up. Um,
Mm.
I've been fortunate, but I also feel like with the loading that I do, you could ask me to, I don't know, pre-test, post-test, some type of maximal strength movement, and they'd probably perform pretty well. So
Yeah, makes sense.
I'd bet almost 10 out of 10 times.
yeah,
Yeah, I'd feel very confident in that.
for sure. Now the
Yeah.
I'll just go through the other because that was just high force. So I feel like that's what gets all the love, and it's great. But there's also fast. So fast is going to be linear speed. I'm not going to go into that. You've had people way smarter than me on this podcast talk about linear speed, so I'll save that for them. But then in the weight room, there's a focus on the foot because I think the foot is like the the starting point for developing more elastic athletes. And Danny, you probably know more about the foot. You probably forgot more about the foot than I know, so I'm not even going to dive into that either. And then there's a rate of force development, early emphasis, and then we transition to oscillatory movements. And then in the accessory portion of training, we get into every rep different movements, reciprocal movements, rotational movements, um, to kind of like round all that out. You'll never see like a bilateral push or traditional horizontal row on a fast force day in accessory movements.
And is this full body typically with you,
Yeah,
or do
yeah.
you break it? Yeah.
We're hitting full body every day we train,
Mm.
and I've never really liked the upper lower splits. There's a lot of other splits, but I think that because the dose and the stimulus is vastly different on every day, I've never had an athlete get blown up from training that way.
Mm.
Um, like we'll hit decels on high force, but it's also structured through the week to where like in an off season, it's strategic to where it's not like I'm just punch them in the face the first 2 days and then they're screwed the rest of the week. Like we'll hit
Right.
fast force early in the week, and like running fast at the dose that I give my team sport athletes, and then hitting some oscillatory movements and reciprocal movements and rotational movements. It's not going to blow you up. It's probably going to like almost potentiate you for the next day.
Right.
Day
Right.
two is going to be our high force day where we're like slamming on the brakes. This is a day where you might have a little fatigue, but typically day three is off, so they get to recover from the first two. Day four is going to be either high or fast again, and then day five, the last day of the week, is slow. So by the time we get to the end of the week, everybody's beat up anyways. But it's slow force. It's I mean, it's not going to feel good in the moment, but it is kind of rejuvenation from the week of what they've just been hit with. So
Mm.
it's structured in a way that like you can, at least from what I've experienced and done, you can train everything every day because the stimulus is very different.
Yeah. Well, on let's dive into slow force and just
Yeah.
like how you came up. You briefly touched on it in the beginning, but how you came up with it and where you
Yeah,
put
I
it in the
mean,
week.
so high and fast were first, and those like included all the principles that I felt were like most beneficial from a performance perspective. But then I was thinking like, okay, I can't just dose basketball players because that's how I work with primarily with a bunch of
Hmm.
hard D cells, a bunch of eccentric loading, linear speed, oscillatory, like all this stuff, and then have them go play basketball. Like they at that point they will get blown up.
Mm.
So I just felt like there has to be a way to offset this. And I've had really, really smart people, mentors of mine, like Kyle Salmons, that I know you guys know. Like
Yeah.
he to me is somebody that has helped build this like slow force pillar more than anybody. And his work and the way he's like taught me and made me feel like an idiot in a very healthy way about like
Yeah. Same.
yielding isometrics and eccentric quasi isometrics and different ways to load tissue as a way to create robustness and health. It was like the perfect marriage to high and fast. And then when I was with the Kings, I worked for a short period, a guy named Jesse Green, who now works for 1080. He worked for the Kings, then the Penguins for a
Yeah.
while. They had a pillar within the training when I was with the Kings that makes total sense, but for some reason I never thought about it. Was a focus on local tissues, and that's a
Mm-hmm.
big pillar of slow force training because everything else throughout the week is global. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm loading guys from a global perspective, but then it's like, okay, well, if you're loading globally, there's probably a distribution of stress and load to a bunch of various tissues, and you're probably not loading one specific tissue directly as potent as if you were to just put them on a machine or put them in a constraint to
Right.
where that local specific tissue is getting load. So that's a
Right.
huge pillar of slow force training to where it's like, okay, for me with my basketball players, and I mean this probably fits with most sports. You could probably throw in a couple things for different sports, but it's the lower leg calf Achilles, it's the adductors, it's the hamstrings, and it's patellar quad tendon. So on, for example, on a slow force day right now in the preseason at the end of a week, the guys come in and we'll hit a like loaded wall slide wall sit through an EQI. Right now we're in like this EQI phase, which is something I took from Eric Mira, who was the guy doing Damian Lillard's Achilles rehab. We had him on the podcast and we were just talking about different ways to like load different tissues. And he's like, I was like, yeah, I love like wall sits. I think they're underrated. And he's like, use a wall slide, have them slide down the wall and turn it into like an eccentric. And I was like, okay, I love
Mm.
that. You put their feet closer to the wall and have them slide, and now their knee gets further over their toe, creating a bigger moment arm, and there's pretty dramatic load on the quad toe tendon. So that's one that we'll do. Just a couple exercise examples: the wall side wall sit, patellar quad, and then we'll do like full kneeling adduction. Well, really, you're going into abduction, but it's for the adductors. Obviously, you're in a full kneeling position on a sore neck roller with one knee, and you're just allowing yourself to move into adduction, and you're getting to the point where like guys have gotten out. Like the first time you do that exercise, you see how like reluctant guys are allowing themselves to get into abduction because when you're moving through that EQI, like there's a lot of length and stress on the adductors. So I really like that one. And then we'll do like a safety bar calf EQI where they're loaded on plates and they've got to really get into like a lengthened position. And then finally for hamstrings, it's just some type of sore neck roller. Right now we're in a single leg, 30-second EQI. So the local tissue loading is just something, especially from like an in-season and health perspective, that I think is just it's so potent, it's so important because most things that people do in a weight room, it's going to be globally loaded. So that's
That's
huge for slow force.
All right, we got to take a second to talk about the universal speed rating because I literally just found this out and it blew my mind. We just hit over 500,000 verified speed tests inside the USR software. 500,000. That's coaches all over the country testing, tracking, and proving athlete progress with this system. It's not just data, it's giving athletes confidence and giving coaches real proof of results. I remember running our first speed lab test back in 2019 in a closet that my uncle helped me build, now 500,000. If you're not testing speed yet or you're doing it without a system, this is your chance to check it out. Hit the link in the description, book a free consult, and see how the USR could work in your program.
Yeah, that's actually exactly the question that I was going to ask was like from a return to play standpoint, I all this makes perfect sense. I know exactly where it fits. When you're talking about just the in season, well, off season to in season programming, this stays pretty consistent throughout the year, or does this become a little bit more prevalent in season? Like, do you take on a little bit more of a quote unquote preventative approach or focus as you get deeper into season? Like, how does that trade off work from high, fast, and slow, let's say from preseason all the way through to the end of season?
Really good question. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and I'll answer how I currently do it, but the archetype quadrants kind of not flip it on its head, but add another element to it. So early off season, guys take a break after the season, they come back. There's not much of a local tissue prep emphasis. It's very general. It's just slow and human loading, but the slow is just kind of like strength at length, getting tissue from a global perspective at long lengths and training it there. And then human force is just very general, and we'll play different games and do different things. But as we get throughout the off season, as we get closer to the in season, this local tissue prep specifically becomes a lot more of an emphasis. And then especially with high minute individuals in season, like that is when I think about every stimulus that I'm going to give an athlete throughout a week, I feel like I have to touch them with local tissue prep at some point. Now that progression that I talked about earlier, where I strategically plan it like fast high and then we go day off, faster high, slow, it flips once we get in season. So like we'll play a game and then game day +1, we'll go slow because guys are beat up. They just played however many minutes. We'll hit them with slow. And then midpoint of the week when practice volume is at its highest, we'll hit them with high. And then right before we play, we'll hit them with fast. So it flips, and there's a huge emphasis on slow force loading for high minute individuals and for all individuals within that preseason period.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Where do you put the human force piece in it? Is that all year?
Yeah. So everything's present all year. It's just that well, high and fast actually aren't present in the earliest off-season block because they just got done playing. We were like strategically, objectively applying high and fast force stimulus throughout the in-season period as kind of like a residual perspective of like how can we maintain these qualities throughout and hopefully nudge them in the right direction. So once we get to the early off season, let's say we have 4 training days, I alternate between slow human, slow human. And the early off season, if we think general to specific throughout an entire year, the early off season is obviously most general. So that is going to be my most general loading, and the most general portion of the force system is human force. So there's a huge dose, 2 full days dedicated to crawling and partner combatives and playing different games, and climbing and carrying things. And then as I transition throughout that off season period, and once we get to like the middle of the off season where I'm like really going to be focused on like the archetype quadrants and things like that, it doesn't phase out, but now it's fast high, faster high, and then it's slow and human kind of stacked together on the same day. So there's still a general element to the training that I think is important regardless of the phase you're in, but it just gets shrunk a little bit. And then once we get to this preseason period, it's really just warm-ups for some of the other days. Like we'll just have like a crawl, carry, climb, warm-up just to keep a general element. And then that kind of stays consistent throughout the in season. They'll come in on a high force day and I'll hit them with just a quick human force warm-up because I think it's great to get ready for any other type of training. And then they'll go into it. And then we'll transition right back into the early off season where it becomes a huge focus.
I love it. What are you working on now? Like the depth and the height part. Can you explain that?
Yeah.
Because I somewhat understand it, but I need more clarity
With
on
the
it.
quadrants specifically.
Yeah, with the quadrants.
Actually, I'm gonna send you guys this after. I put together like a presentation that I think will be helpful for the stuff that we're gonna do in the future. To kind of understand it a little bit, I put together like 28 slides that I'm gonna send you guys that kind of lays this all out. But to try to keep it as clear as possible. So really, I was thinking about the ways to create this spectrum that a lot of people talk about from like elastic to muscular perspective. And I've looked so much into counter movement depth as a metric. And it seems like it's like the redheaded stepchild of like force plate metrics because everybody wants to talk about like breaking RFD and relative peak propulsive power and the strategy metric of counter movement depth I think just tells you so much if the cueing and constraints you put around the movement, in this terms of CMJ on a force plate, is in a way that an athlete expresses what they naturally want to express. Like they're innate. And what I mean by that is I think that like on a vertec, the only goal is to jump as high as humanly possible.
Yeah.
So athletes are going to change their strategy to achieve that outcome. Now, on a force plate, athletes are still trying to jump as high as possible. I tell them to jump fast and high to your I'm trying to think of I use basketball examples. Like the person I always think about is Al Horford. Fast and high to Al Horford is going to look a lot different than fast and high to John Morant.
Right.
So now they're going to self-select what depth at which they want to move through to accomplish the task of jumping fast and high. Now, if we think about what happens at different depths of movement in a CMJ, if you move through a huge depth of counter movement, it's probably because you want to spend a little bit more time on the ground, create a little bit more impulse. And as we get into deeper ranges of motion, we're probably leveraging musculature. We probably want to harness the power of like big movers of the lower body. Now, if we think the opposite end of that spectrum and we think of a very shallow counter movement depth, can you guys hear a shit ton of feet like background in mine? My daughters are going crazy.
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay. So you think of the opposite, shallow counter movement. It's probably because that athlete doesn't want or doesn't need to leverage those big musculature that the deep counter movement is going to give them, and they really just want to create a really rapid stretch of connective tissue and use it to get off the ground really fast. So I think you guys hear that? My daughters are freaking nuts.
It's all good.
So give me 1 second.
Oh yeah.
My mom's here babysitting him right now, so I just texted him. Hopefully she'll quiet him down.
I wish. I wish I had that.
Yeah, it's clutch. She's here for a week, and it makes my life so much easier. Okay, so like that's the x-axis of the quadrants. It goes from shallow counter movement depth to deep counter movement depth. Okay, now the y, I've messed around with looking at like modified reactive strength on the y, and I've talked to a couple people like Drake at Hawken and different people that really understand metrics and plates really, really well. And what I didn't like about using modified reactive strength in version 1 of this is that modified reactive strength is kind of skewed toward time to take off. If you have a really, really fast time to take off and like a very average to below average jump height, your modified reactive strength is going to be really good compared to the guy that has a solid time to take off and a really high jump height. His modified reactive strength isn't going to be as good. And that to me kind of like skews data and it pulls it to the top left, shallow counter movement and high modified reactive strength, which I didn't like. So then I was like, okay, let's just look at jump height. Like you can look at counter movement depth and jump height. Now that might skew things to the top right because guys that spend a little bit more time on the ground are probably going to end up jumping a little bit higher. But what I saw whenever I did that is that it didn't. There was still honestly a majority of the guys in the top 2 quadrants in that top left quadrant. So shallow counter movement depth, high jump height. So I was like, okay. And the distribution of the data just looked a lot cleaner. It wasn't pooled, which I appreciated because I know the range of movers that I've had over the last 3 years when I did this. Now, the last piece I added to this, and you can do all that, what I just talked about, like on Hawkins quadrant charts that they have, which is high level. You can pick any metrics you want, boom, boom, X, Y. But then I was thinking is like a layer to this. I still wanted to include some sort of modified reactive strength because if you're just looking at jump height and only quantifying it that way, well, then you don't think about like, okay, how long is it actually taking them to move through that range of motion and achieve that jump height? So then using, it'd be cool if I could code all this, but I definitely can't. I used AI, created another graph that included time to takeoff based on the size of the dot. So now X counter movement depth, Y jump height, size of dot relative to time to take off. The bigger the dot, the faster the time to take off. The smaller the dot, the slower the time to take off. So that just adds a whole nother element.
Do you feel like,
go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt.
No,
do you feel like the time to take off is correlated with the counter movement depth?
Yeah.
At all?
Yeah, it is for sure. But what's really helpful is now whenever we start talking about movement, left, right, up, down, now I can look and I can think, okay, if because you got, and I'll just say this just so I can begin to speak in this in the names because it's easier. Top right would be high jump height, deep counter movement depth. That is what I call cannons. Shift over one, high jump height, shallow counter movement depth is what I call whips. Bottom left, small jump height, small counter movement depth is what I call rubber bands. And then bottom right, deep counter movement depth, low jump height is what I call anchors. Okay, so now if you're working in the top two quadrants and you have a whip or a cannon and you're trying to optimize them, they already jump really high and they've already probably settled into a strategy that's best for them. And you look at somebody maybe as a cannon top right, and they're very vertical, maybe the most vertical athlete on your chart, but they have a tiny little dot. It's because they're relying on jump height. So the thing that you could potentially give them to enhance their qualities to make them even better, like if a guy in my world is jumping 60 hands on hips, 60 centimeters hands on hips on the plates, like, okay, jump height is not what I need to add to that individual. Mm-hmm. But if he's getting off the ground slow as hell to do it and moving through, I don't know, 45 centimeters of counter movement depth, okay, the thing I can give that individual is time to take off. And I realize that now with the size of the dot and the horizontal placement on the quadrants. And to the question you just asked, like, yeah, there is correlation there. Guys on the right side are probably going to have smaller dots than the guys on the left side. But you can look at the extremes. And an example I just gave, like, okay, that guy's a tiny dot. He's way far on the right. Let's try to move him left and try to keep him vertical. Because then I'm maybe just shortening up his counter movement depth a little bit. I'm getting him off the ground faster. And he's still jumping 58 centimeters. Cool. That's a win for me. You know what I mean?
Do you find any like injury or soreness patterns that are unique to their quadrants, like kind of like how we do James Wilds and all that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't been able to dig into that one with my data specifically, but something that since we started talking, I've like looked into the James Wild quadrants more than like I ever have in my life. I just listened to him on Just Fly yesterday when we were coming back from Houston just to like understand it better, and I've texted you guys an annoying amount about like different things about it. And just like looking at what he's laid out, I don't think the quadrants overlay perfectly one to one. Like, I don't think you can just put the archetype quadrants on top of his because of what I said earlier. I feel like his is strategy based 100%. Mine is output and strategy based. But I do think there is slight correlation. And me and Danny talked about this. And his quadrants, unless you can confirm or deny this, that are probably going to have the most elastic athletes would be bounders and bouncers. Do you agree or disagree?
For sure.
Okay, so if you overlay these quadrants, James Wild and the archetype, though bounder and bouncer are his top left, bottom left. My top left, bottom left are whips and rubber bands. Now, I think spinners gets a little bit different compared to anchors. Like, I don't think that lines up. Cannons, I think, can line up a little bit. But when I look at James Wild quadrants, and you guys know it a lot better than I do, but you can confirm or deny this as well. If we move from drivers to spinners to bouncers to bounders, so we just kind of make a circle around them, it kind of goes from proximal to distal from an injury pattern perspective. So when I'm thinking about mine, that injury pattern makes sense as well. Because if I'm working with, well, I just zoomed in. So AI camera, watch this. Make a little.
What in the alien?
It's supposed to zoom out, but now it's not working. There we go.
I would pay $3,000 to see Danny do that.
Now I'm just going to be zoomed in on my face the whole time.
That's a really interesting point, though.
Yeah, so like if you think about the quadrants that I have, and if you move in that same sequence, you go from cannons to anchors to rubber bands to whips. In my head, now I can't proof this with the data I have yet, but if you move in that same sequence in mine, I think it makes sense to move from proximal to distal. Like, you're moving from your explosive deep counter movements Now the anchors is the one that gets a little bit fuzzy because that's still deep counter movement, but it's poor jump height. So these are just like your bad, more muscular driven movers. But then you move to your rubber bands, who are your not as potent, as impressive elastic movers. And then you move to like your elastic best movers. And to me, that proximal to distal injury sequence kind of makes sense. So it's something I began thinking about because, again, the quadrants don't overlay perfectly, but I do think that there's some correlation. So if I were to answer this question right now without having proof, I would say that I think about it from like a proximal distal distribution.
Les, can I jump in on that real quick?
Yeah.
So kind of a two-part question here, but the first part of this is, what's the goal? And I'll give context by saying, like, keeping the comparison here, the James Wild quadrants are, in my mind, more interpretive, where we're looking at spatiotemporal qualities, we're looking at strategy-based, differences in movements, to just give deeper descriptions of how athletes are effectively doing the same tasks, right? In the combine, it's pretty simple. Got 25, 30 guys. All of them do it uniquely or differently or with an individual strategy, but they're doing the exact same task. So the outcome of those for me, especially on the health side, is having a deeper analysis of where we may see vulnerability as we go through this training process. But with yours, it's a little bit different. So again, I reiterate, like, is this to help with programming decisions? Is this to help, convey information to staff? Is this to, just have a better proxy on the individual archetypes within your group? Like, what is the utility of this for you?
Great question. And obviously the most important thing. It's cool to make a quadrant chart, but like, how the hell are you going to use it? This is it to me. So you have this spectrum of athletes. You have elastic movers, you have muscular movers. And I think that, like, whether people want to say that's like voodoo science or not, like, there's archetypes of athletes. You look at
100%.
I don't know, the football example I like to use, because obviously if you talk about offensive linemen to receivers, you can point that out easily. But even in the same position group, you look at like Xavier Worthy and AJ Brown. It's like those dudes are so incredibly different. Now,
Yeah.
to relate it to my quadrants, I think AJ Brown is probably a cannon, and Xavier Worthy at this point in his career is probably a rubber band. He's a very fast rubber band, but he's probably a rubber band. Okay, so now, and I'll use this as an example to my population because I actually have data on them, is I create my quadrant chart and I look and I think, does the quadrant that this person represent in right now make sense? And the way that I like proof makes sense is I think about the structure of that athlete and then the quadrant that they represent in. Now I'll give you an example. I have a kid on this year's team who is 6'8", 230, the epitome of a muscular driven mover. He doesn't really love the weight room, but that's a whole nother story. But like, if you were to measure his ISA, probably 110 plus for sure. Like, I like to look at like the lower leg structure, calf to Achilles. Like, elastic movers are probably gonna have a really long Achilles, short muscle bellies. Opposite for muscular, he has long calf, short, like just the epitome of a muscular driven mover. And he's a rubber band. He's almost as far left. He's the furthest left dot on the initial assessment. And I think, and he's low. Obviously, he's in that third rubber band quadrant. And I think to myself, that is not an optimal movement strategy that he's choosing for himself. Now, if I were to just look at him and think, okay, all I were to say were like, let's look at your jump height, or let's look at some other metrics, and I didn't necessarily plot it, and I didn't have the comparative power of like a quadrant chart, I would say like, okay, he doesn't jump very high, let's have him jump higher. And I would dose him with things to make him hopefully jump higher. But he is self-selecting a strategy of 26 centimeter counter movement depth that is never going to be productive for him. Now you take it a step further and I add a layer to this whole equation. And this person who had bilateral patellar tendonitis injections a year ago. So then you add the layer of injury history and you're like, okay, this individual is self-selecting a movement strategy here in a very like controlled environment of a CMJ on a force plate that is not optimal for his structure. And the structure piece is huge to this whole thing. Now, why? Because of his injury history. Okay, so now what can I give this athlete to shift him right? Because people could argue, like, well, you want him to have a short counter movement depth, you want him to get off the ground super fast. Like, yeah, that is a goal, but everybody's going to have an optimal strategy. And his optimal strategy, in my opinion, is leveraging bigger musculature. And at 26 centimeters of counter movement depth, you're not doing that. So I need to expose him to things, some high force loading, some slow force loading for the tissue that's been so damaged in the past, some deep tier plyometrics to remove the inhibition from his previous injury and get him moving into a bigger counter movement depth to leverage the tissue that he innately is going to be better at leveraging to then move him vertical. Now, the only other example I'll give is some individuals who are, and you don't see this necessarily as much, but I think maybe in football you could, is the opposite. You have this really elastic individual who's been trained like a power lifter for 4 years, and now they're assuming a strategy that's a deep counter movement depth, and they're not very effective with it. Like if you're choosing a deep counter movement, you better have really good output from a jump height perspective to make up for the time that it takes you to move through that counter movement. And if they're moving through a big counter movement and they're not achieving 55, 56, 57 centimeter jump height, which they probably never will because they're not innately leveraged to produce a lot of movement with big musculature, then we need to get them back shifted left, allow them to rely on the innate superpower of getting off the ground fast and moving through a short counter movement. And then maybe they're probably never going to jump 58 centimeters, but maybe they're jumping 50, 51, and that's really good for them.
That's a great answer. And Les, I know I'm going a little bit off script here, so I apologize.
No, keep going.
I just think this is a really important point, man, because we're at we're at somewhat of an inflection point of human performance in my mind, where we need to kind of keep perspective of this, where we really are the first gen of heavy tech, heavy software, heavy data, biographical collections within this field, right? And we all know that this is still in its infancy and it's kind of frontline frontier stuff. And so whenever I'm putting stuff like this together, because Hunter, what I think you've developed objectively and honestly is really, really incredible. Les, I can speak for hours on all the work that you've done and how much you've, incorporated and influenced me with all of this systemization and tracking stuff. But when I'm putting these things together or when I'm reviewing them, I almost put on like my Buddy Morris hat or my Al Vermeil hat, and I'm like, okay, what would these guys say? And at what point are we overly complexifying or getting too granular with things? And how can we keep that superficial surface level purpose very vivid and clear for why we're going through all of this, And I struggle with that, again, honestly, like I kind of go back and forth on like, there is sophistication to our work. We do need to continue to get deeper. We do need to utilize the tools that are available to us, but at what cost? And how can we still relate that back to an overarching purpose of why we are going through what we're going through, apart from just loving this stuff and loving to get lost in it, And I think that applies equally for all three of us.
Yeah, no, I agree. Quick pause here. I want to talk about the universal speed rating. So many coaches I meet are just overwhelmed. They're running sessions, programming, dealing with parents, and trying to prove their athletes are actually getting faster. One of the reasons why we built USR was to take some of this stress off the table. One software solution to help coaches test, track, and show improvement without adding hours to your week. If you feel like you're guessing with your speed training or drawing trying to make sense of your data, hit the link in the description. Schedule a free consult and see how the USR can help. I guess the follow up to that is this your primary profiling system for your players? Like you get a new player comes in tomorrow, like is this what the first thing that you're doing with him?
I would say yes, honestly. I think my now there's I'm not saying this is the only thing, but it's the most effective and efficient thing if you marry those two things together. Um, because I don't know, I've had guys for 16, 17 weeks, and I've probably gotten 50 to 60 jumps on all of them. So like it's something that I'm getting early and often. So now I can create this and look at plots throughout an entire year. Now there's other things I do, like we'll run fly tens, we'll do 4 jumps on the plates, we'll do a lot of different things. We'll run 10.05s, 5.05s. But all of those have like a small cost, and there's a time and place that they fit. There's a time and place they don't. I can bring plates anywhere. I can do it now. I'd like to try to create the same testing environment every single time. So ideally it's after our speed stuff, or it's during a fast force training session. Now, if we're training after practice, that changes the kind of like the environment, but I can do it year round. And it's the one thing that I know without fail, I'm going to get at least one data point all year. So to me, it's like, is it the only thing I do? No, but is it the most consistent thing I do? Yes. And I think, Danny, to your point, I, and this isn't necessarily answering that question, but just to touch on what you said, Danny, is the complexity piece. Like, are we doing it for ourselves because it's cool? Are we doing it for the athletes because it actually helps them? And one of the small things that I like debated with myself, and it's going to sound dumb when I say this out loud right now, is like when I was choosing the way to represent this on a quadrant chart, and I knew counter movement depth was going to be my X, and I was thinking about the metrics for the Y. I was like, jump height is like too simple. Like I need something fancier, like peak relative propulsive power or modified reactive strength. And I was like, wait a second. Now, if you add the time to take off qualifier, just use jump height. Like it's so simple. Counter movement depth and jump height. It's like the I don't know, the ego inside of me was like, no, you got to choose something cooler so it like pops more. But it's like, no, it makes total sense. Like counter movement depth, jump height.
Yeah.
I mean,
Do you go ahead? Dan.
yeah, go ahead.
Do you see it as a stable metric? Like, does it change over the course of the season, week to week, and like, do you have rubber bands that are whips on week 2 and then anchors on week 3?
Yeah,
You know.
it's a really good question. And what I've seen for doing this now for, I don't know, a month, of like actually like looking at it progressively. Now I've backlogged data for 3 years, so I've been able to kind of see where guys represent over 3 years. But what I've noticed is that the counter movement depth bandwidth is pretty small. The jump height bandwidth is a little bit larger, but it's not as noisy as like a rate of force development metric. Rate of force development metrics are going to be all over the board anytime you test. But like those two metrics, counter movement depth is very stable. Jump height is fairly stable. So what I've seen is I'll see a guy who's like fringe anchor cannon move up into the cannon category because he has a really good jump that day. Or a rubber band move to a whip. And then unfortunately, sometimes I see whips move to rubber bands and vice versa. The one thing that's cool, and I think it makes sense for every performance coach to talk about improving performance, especially it's easy once an athlete's settled into a strategy that works for them or that it's going to work for them. The one that's cool is that example I gave earlier of the individual who's dealing with that. He's had a host of lower body issues. He's kind of dealing with a lower body issue right now, and he's had that bilateral patellar tendinopathy in the past that's been pretty severe. Is now having the project of trying to shift him right. Vertical shift is what we do. Like, especially with an athlete that's settled into a strategy that works for them, like vertical shift, yeah, cool. Like, make people jump higher. Change their strategy from like a subconscious perspective, not just like I could get anybody I could get this kid on the plates and say like, hey, just like spend a little bit more time on the ground or really sink into this jump. And it would obviously change his counter movement depth. But what I want to try to do is expose him to stimuli throughout the week, throughout a training cycle, throughout a whatever, to where now his innate subconscious movement pattern is moving in a direction that is more optimal for him. And I think it's awesome when guys move from rubber bands to whips or anchors to cannons. But what I think is like the more challenging thing and more rewarding thing is getting people to shift horizontally, because that is now changing a movement strategy, not just adding output to a system.
Danny, you had a follow up on that?
No, I mean, I think this is a really good conversation. I think it's a really important one, and I relate it back to what I said a moment ago, where like, we're on the front line of this, and there's so many people in our industry that, again, quite frankly, are doing really brilliant work. And I think, the ultimate goal of any systemization or any kind of, unification of metrics and things like this are always going to be designed from the standpoint of how do I optimize my personal work situation? And then it's always followed up with, okay, now how do I take what I've developed for my situation and then would likely be helpful for others in the field? And I think that's exactly what we're all really trying to do. But, to Les's point on this, it's like we have to understand that we have the capacity to do more now. So it's kind of on us to figure out what that alignment is and what it looks like. And I can continue to just kind of give you, compliments on this all day long, but like I think you've done a really, really good job of that. And this is really interesting to me. The question here is, do you feel like the growth or evolution of this is going to be driven more by the reception of how it exists in other settings, or that maybe the input or data that you get from others in this in your field or in similar fields? Or do you think it's going to continue to develop as a utility for what you're doing in person in house? And kind of how do you evaluate that?
So to the first part of your question, I think that the systemization of things is obviously very important, and it's just the way my brain works. Like I'm just a systematic type thinker, and I have to remind myself to add some subjectivity, to add some just like general observation. And Stu's somebody that I know you guys talk about all the time on this podcast, but he's somebody that I look at and like I've never seen Stu jump a single person on plates ever, but his eye of just like subjective evaluation and so good at subjective evaluation it's probably objective at this point which I don't know if that kind of like is like a bad or a bad thing to like say subjective is moving to objective and just let it live in the subjective realm. But with that being said, whenever I before I had kind of like this framework of the quadrants, it was such like a I think this makes sense. Like some of these variables I'm looking at look this way. Like I'd be looking at 4 jump modified reactive strength to jump height on a CMJ, and I think that this just gives a system to work with it. Now to the second part of your question, I think because of that, and now I don't have data from 40 different sports to know if it looks this way, but what I would say is that I think that this is a way to systematically apply the force system in specific ways to shift athletes in the direction that you think they should be shifted. Now, that part is going to be up to the practitioner to like understand their athlete, understand the movement strategy that you think is going to be best for that athlete. But once you decide that and you know, like, okay, I have a rubber band who probably should be a cannon. How am I going to shift them right and up or just diagonal to the right? Boom, like, okay, now I'm thinking in the force system. I'm like, okay, if I have a wide ISA individual that's acting like a rubber band, they need to move through deeper counter movements and ultimately produce higher output in a CMJ. And hopefully that change in movement strategy, that increase in output contributes to other things on the court, on the field, because now they're self-selecting subconsciously a movement strategy works for them. I think that like with the 3 years of data I have and the movement I've already seen, I think like to me, and obviously I'm biased, but to me it checks out in basketball. Like I'm very comfortable with the counter movement depth of the basketball population. I'm very comfortable with the
Right.
jump height bandwidth. Now to me, it's getting a whole other host of data and being like, whoa, these are very different counter movement depths. These are very different jump heights. This is what the distribution of data looks like from, I don't know, volleyball. Like, okay,
Right.
does it make sense to shift these individuals? What are the structure types within baseball? You know what I mean? So I think that there's some nuance there that the practitioner has to understand. but it doesn't take a brain surgeon to look at offensive lineman and Xavier Worthy and realize that there's different structures in sport and be able to apply that model to your setting.
No doubt. Yeah.
The one thing I will say, and something I've thought about throughout this process a decent amount, is the Caterina Macario case study that both you guys laid out for me and Mike on the podcast, Danny when we were in San Diego live, and then Les when we had you on the podcast a couple weeks ago. When you guys, and Les, you were talking about the way she was kind of like presenting and how it probably didn't work for her because that's not like innately how her structure and body is built. And you wanted to like shift her to different, like I was just imagining her in the quadrants and probably presenting as an anchor and probably needing to be a whip. And what you guys did, if you were to look back at the data and look at these simple metrics of counter movement depth, jump height, and then overlaying time to takeoff, is I bet you if you had normative axes, you probably just moved her from anchor to whip, and that's like the innate movement preference of her system. And now she's probably dealing with less because she's leveraging the tissue that she's like predisposed to be able to leverage well, and getting away from being an anchor and just leveraging.
Yeah, I'm gonna send you our login so you could just go through Cat and all of our football guys.
Huge.
Yeah. All right, so final piece. If you were working with our NFL Combine group, how would you apply the force system?
Great question. So I think it's a microcosm of everything we've just talked about. And I think that the one thing that I continue to think about on the front end is when you create the quadrants, do you create the quadrants based on kind of like what I just talked about, normative but solidified axes? Or do you create the quadrants based on the population that you are working with?
It's the population we work with.
But I mean, I guess when I say that, I mean specifically the group, like just this combine group or all of combine groups you ever had.
It's all of our professional football players.
Yeah.
Breaking into like skill mids and bigs, but they're compared to professional skill mids or bigs.
Yeah. And I think
it's a pretty large group.
And I think that's the best way to do it is you take a backlog of data of the same/similar populations and you create the quadrants, and then you overlay the current group that you're currently working with training to see where they fit based on histories and history of data.
Yeah.
So then you do that. You see you're going to have some whips, you're going to have some cannons, rubber bands, anchors. Now, if you're working with rubber bands and anchors based on historical data, you understand that from an output perspective, at least from a CMJ, not very good. Yeah. But then you have to ask the question, does it make sense for them to be a rubber band or an anchor based on their structure? Okay, so some very elastic individuals are probably going to end up being anchors because they've been trained like a powerlifter for 4 years in college, and it's like, okay, we need to allow this individual to harness connective tissue better again because they don't do it very well right now because they've been pulled away. And on the opposite side, you have some wide ISA individuals that are short counter movement depth. Hey, is there an injury history here? What are we doing in the lower body? Like what's the issue? One thing that I've seen or thought about is an individual that is presenting in one of the two lower quadrants that are not structurally, it doesn't structurally make sense for them to be in there. Is there an injury history? Because I think that movement strategy is going to be altered a lot, especially from a counter movement depth perspective, based on some type of injury history. Okay, so you have your quadrants. You know that the athletes in the bottom are supposed to be there or aren't supposed to be there. Okay, if they're not supposed to be there, you dose them with what they need. You have a wide IS individual who is presenting a short counter movement depth. That's kind of like the case study I presented earlier. We need to figure out why from an injury history. If there's no injury history, just expose them to deeper counter movements and movements through a fuller range of motion, deeper range of motion, and get them shifted right. Now, if we're talking about the other, we need to expose them to things like short counter movements and more elastic movements to get them shifted left.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we're dealing with cannons and whips, this is where, and Danny, you were talking about like from a health perspective, this is where I've kind of thought a little bit differently about cannons and whips, is especially like the athletes that are most vertical with big circles. So very high jump height, very high time to take off. They wouldn't be up there if that wasn't the movement strategy that makes sense for them. So I'm not thinking left or right. I'm thinking about optimizing where they're at. And one of the things that I've thought about is with those athletes, like the most impressive of the group with the highest outputs, they come in running a 4.2. It's like, okay, yeah, you want to make them run faster, but if they run a 4.2, they're probably going to get paid and get drafted in a high position. Dose them with a little bit more slow force, because now we're just trying to kind of like protect outputs. Now, I'm not saying you don't do the stuff that you're going to like you do on the field less, like you're still hitting excels, hitting max velocity stuff, whatever. But from a weight room perspective, I think you're just very precise with the dose of fast and high force that you give them, and continue to layer on like a robustness of those outputs with more slow force. So if I'm dealing in the bottom quadrants, okay, I'm not saying that you just like blow these guys up and don't dose them with slow force, but I think the distribution of like health to output changes when you're on the top versus the bottom. So
100%.
quadrants, does it make sense? If not, shift them. If it does, increase outputs once they get to the top and they're vertical hot or big dots, a little bit more dosage of slow force, because we've got to protect the outputs that they have and allow some of the specific stuff that you're doing on the field to be one consistent, so they don't deal with something throughout the summer or throughout the training process, and be very precise with the dose of high and fast that you give them.
Mm. Danny, I know you got some follow-ups on that.
I mean, not anything beyond. I agree. I agree 100% on all that. That's exactly how I've been kind of thinking about it throughout this talk, and when we talked over the weekend. Because again, like my lens is obviously biased. Like that's my job. That's my role. Is what is the risk stratification based on whether it's quadrants or it's raw data or whatever, right? That's how I'm always evaluating it. But to me, that makes a ton of sense, and I think to tie that back to the previous question that I had asked is like, to me, that's the reinforcement for why we get this granular, or why we have these different organizations, or we're modeling things in this way, is because ultimately it comes down to protecting the assets. So in the combine sense, it's we need to preserve health along the way of improving performance, because if you can't run in Indy, doesn't matter how fast you can run, right? You take that exact same context, you apply it to the basketball season, you apply it to a football, it is the same thing, right? So to me, that's the purpose behind it. And I think that, the way that you have this designed is very intuitive. And it just really applies well, in my opinion.
And I think that like the last thing I'll say, and to your point, Danny, is like athletes presenting with pain aren't going to be able to produce the outputs they'd be able to produce if they weren't in pain. So when I say like whips and cannons, let's prioritize some slow force loading to offset, complement the stuff that's happening on the field, accels, decels, max velocity, whatever. I also think like if you're dealing with an anchor or you're dealing with a rubber band that's in pain, okay, well, like, yeah, maybe they're slower relative, but like they also are gonna probably just run faster if they're not in pain. So I think that if you're dealing with a rubber band or an anchor that is presenting pain, let's dose them with some more specific local tissue prep, some more slow force loading early on to try to get them out of pain. Because once they're out of pain, they might present completely different. Like the example I'll use, and this is something I didn't mention earlier. If you're dealing with like a Xavier Worthy build that's presenting as an anchor, maybe they've been trained like powerlifter and their natural innate strategy has shifted. Or, and this is the case that I've seen, is I have some very narrow elastic individuals that present in when I look at the quadrants, and this is something that I wish I would have thought of earlier to help me. And it's something I also should have realized real time, but I didn't really think about it enough is I have these narrow elastic individuals that now when I look in the quadrant, they're presenting as an anchor. And I think about that individual specifically that I'm thinking about. He was an anchor. He was super low. His dot was super small, but he should have been a whip, like the epitome of it. 6'6", long. When he plays, athletic, moves extremely well. And I'm like, man. And then you remember back, oh, this dude dealt with maybe the worst patellar tendinopathy of any athlete I've had over 3 years. And I was so like, I don't know, naive, dumb, whatever at that point because it was my first year and just trying to figure everything out. It's like I should have just dosed the hell out of slow force because if I would have just got his knees feeling a little bit better, he would have probably been a whip without increasing output at all. So I think that's an important part to the equation as well is like, why are they presenting in the quadrant that they're in? If they're completely healthy and it's like, no, I feel good. This is like, what are you talking about? Okay, well, maybe we need to shift left or right. If they're like, yeah, I'm dealing with this chronic, acute, whatever injury, well, let's get that to the point where they're not thinking about it and they don't have to think about it and now see where they present. Because if a guy comes in with patellar tendinopathy, like I deal with in basketball all the time, he's not going to present as a whip because that is the last movement strategy that you want to choose if there's a hot tendon in your lower body, especially at your knee. You do not want to load that tendon. You want to stay away from it. So you're gonna assume like a hip flexor strategy, which is probably going to move you into an anchor category because you're going to spend more time on the ground. You're not going to present in a stiff flexor strategy where you're like loading tendons. So I think that's an important aspect of this whole thing. And I don't necessarily know how beat up the guys are that you get right off the bat, but I'm assuming there's a lot of them that aren't feeling 100%. So I think that is important is like, let's load them in a way to get them feeling better to then see where they represent in the quadrants as opposed to just like taking the initial assessment and that's the only assessment and that's where they live. And now let's make decisions off that because once they're feeling good, they could present completely differently.
Brilliant.
Yeah. No, it's brilliant. Let's do it. Let's figure it out.
Yeah. No, I think the most informative process is creating the normative quadrants to then be able to compare current classes to.
Yeah. No, we have a couple years. I think we got 4 years in our system right now, so probably 100 players.
Yeah.
So it's good enough. And then what would be interesting, maybe as a follow-up podcast, I know you got to run soon, but
I'm good.
We go through some of the problem cases. We'll hide their names, but just go through the problem cases, and I'll give you what we did, and then you tell me kind of like, hey, if you had done these 3 things, and that way, like I can understand it. And I think also for our listeners, like they're gonna understand how they could take a simple strategy because this is simple. Like if you think about it, there's 100 force plate metrics, and people talk about RFD, talk about impulse, talk about all these things. I think finding a way to simplify it, even if you don't have force plates, you can start to look at it through that lens. Because I'm imagining like my coaches that deal with youth athletes, they're not jumping them on force plates every week, but if they did a jump, you could see do they have a shallow depth and do they jump high? Like it's pretty easy to understand. You could archetype somebody just from watching how they move, and then you back into okay, where should I focus on? You know your training program and how do I move you? I think it's brilliant, and I think you've put a lot of creativity into it. And if you've heard me talk about creativity, I think it's just connecting a bunch of things. Like Steve Jobs was the most creative person of our generation, well, not even our generation, but like of our time, because he connected the phone, an iPod, and a messaging app into one thing called the iPhone, and that created so many other creative things. And I think what you're doing is bringing a lot of the research and things that have been done over the past couple of years and saying all that's important, but here's the easiest way you can access that and start to look at this. And Danny and I talk about this all the time. Like, how do you find the simplest way to move forward? Like, there's a lot of complex ways to move forward, but what's the simplest way? Because the complexity comes in our decision making process. It doesn't come in the profiling process. Like, the more complicated the profiling process, is, then the harder it is to get the actual intervention at the back end of it. So this is awesome, dude. And I appreciate you coming on here and giving us this, because it's relatively new for me to hear you talk about this. Like I've heard a little bit, but just getting that past hour, I mean, that was incredible,
Yeah, man.
honestly.
No, I'm
Yeah.
well, one, I appreciate you guys because it's been helpful for me to have somebody that's kind of like using these ideas, which is an honor for me. And I told you that less on our podcast. Like whenever you're talking about using it, I was like goosebumps because it's crazy to have like something that you've tried to create and other high level practitioners are starting to use it. And like to your complexity pieces, you should have seen me trying to write out a decision tree for this process. And the first one I wrote, I like confused the hell out of myself. I was like drawing
Yeah.
arrows, drawing boxes, and I was like, okay, I need to slow down and like make this simple because to your point, and I've run into this before, is like you have this complex decision tree with like different things, if this, then that, yes, no. And it's like, then when you actually go to apply it, you're like, well, this is going to take me 45 minutes for each guy because this is the most confusing thing of all time. So like taking a step back, swallowing my ego. It doesn't need to be the most complex, flashy thing ever that's going to look cool when I talk about it, because that's probably not applicable when you actually try to apply it. So yeah, the simplicity piece is something I'm continuing to refine. And honestly, I want to go from complex to very, very simple. And it's something I think you guys
Mm.
do well when you're conveying messages. So no, I appreciate it. And it's been super helpful for me to be able to get on here and try to explain it and talk to you guys about it, because it's just been so many thoughts and ideas and presentations and notes written down that it's nice to be able to kind of refine it from a conversation perspective.
Yeah, no, I love it. Send me that presentation,
Yeah.
and Danny, we got to have Hunter back on soon. Follow up.
Don't threaten me with a good time.
Yeah, anytime, fellas. I got mornings free, so let me know.
Awesome. All right, guys. Appreciate you.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate you, bro.